All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Missy Ryan. I'm a journalist with the Washington Post, and I'm really thrilled to be here today for this very timely and topical panel on the military dimension of the war between Israel and Hamas that is unfolding and now in its fifth day. I'm thrilled to be joined here by a really fantastic group of panelists. I'm going to briefly introduce them, and then we're going to just dive in and keep it focused on the military dimension as much as we can over the next 60 minutes. I'm joined here today by Mick Mulroy, former intelligence and Pentagon official who is a non-resident senior fellow and co-director of the Yemen Steering Initiative with the Middle East Institute. Ken Pollack, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and of course, Bilal Saab, senior fellow and founding director of the Defense and Security Program here at MEI. So I'm going to jump in. We are on day 5 of the latest eruption of violence between Israel and Hamas, and it is looking qualitatively different and more threatening than anything we've seen in the past. So I thought we would start by trying to take a quick look at how we got here. Ken, I'm going to ask you to address the echoes of previous confrontations between Israel and some of its Arab neighbors, 1973 in particular. And then Mick, I'm going to ask you to talk about whether or not this was an intelligence failure and what we should be thinking about in terms of drawing lessons from that. Ken, why don't you kick it off?
Sure. Thanks, Missy. Thank you, Bilal and MEI, for putting this together. So I'll start by saying that everyone has pointed out that this happened 50 years and a day after the start of the 1973 October War. It's important to recognize because I don't think that this was at all coincidental. And the parallels are really striking. Anyone who actually knows anything about the military dimensions in particular of the October War, I think it's very clear that Hamas took a page right out of that playbook. They understood how formidable the Israeli military is. They understood that its defenses would not be easy to breach. They, like the Egyptians, spent a long time working this problem, figuring out exactly how the Israelis operated, figuring out physically the layout of Israel's defenses, looking for gaps, looking for chinks in the armor that they could exploit, but simultaneously also studying Israel's tactics, its doctrine, its standard operating procedures very, very carefully. And again, very much like the Egyptians, devising a set of devilishly clever ways of exploiting all of this. Now, when I say that I think they've spent years developing this, and we're starting to see press pieces more or less confirming that, I don't necessarily mean that they've been planning this operation for years. They've been doing this for years. They've been fighting Israel since 1987. They've learned that you have to do this. There's a Darwinian struggle for survival. The smart ones and Hamas survived and learned that you always have to go after the Israelis this way. I think they've been doing that rather constantly, but certainly at some point, maybe a year or two ago, maybe just in recent months, they began to pull all of this together. And again, like the Egyptians in 1973, they secured strategic surprise. I will leave that up to Mick and Bilal to explain how that happened, but they were able to use strategic surprise and all of these tricks and stratagems and workarounds that they came up with to inflict this absolutely shocking, terrifying, and horrifying massacre, also military defeat against Israel. Right. But just like the Egyptians, and I know we're going to talk about this in a little bit, so I won't jump the gun, but just like the Egyptians, they know a response is coming. And, we should also remember that in 1973, the Egyptian operation, which was brilliant in so many ways, and again, so many parallels, right? When I saw the photograph of the Hamas bulldozers going through those fences, a very simple way of overcoming a complex problem, but it reminded me very much of the Egyptians using water cannons to blast their way through the 30-meter high sand barriers that the Israelis had constructed. Again, just almost identical. But just as the Egyptians had come up with a very clever plan for mounting this initial offensive, getting across the canal, so too the Egyptians had a very complex and sophisticated defense scheme that they had already put in place and were ready to execute to absorb the inevitable Israeli counteroffensives. And I think that we, and more importantly, the Israelis, need to be aware, recognize that it is likely that Hamas has also done the same when it comes to defending Gaza.
I think that's a great point, and certainly we're seeing the ongoing rocket and missile attacks from Hamas, even as the Israelis mass for what looks like it's going to be this ground offensive. I asked the question at the beginning, was this an intelligence failure? It seems evident that it was, and Israeli officials are acknowledging as much, but I'm wondering if you can sort of dig in and tell us, from your perspective and your experience working in military and intelligence agencies, how could this have happened, and what conclusions should we be drawing about Israel's ability to not just neutralize the imminent threat, but come to some sort of sustainable arrangement with Hamas in Gaza?
So, Missy, I think you're right. I think it is unfortunately, obviously, an intelligence failure, a very, very significant one. So, the complexity of the attack itself, bringing in so many logistical needs, weapons, munitions, special equipment, jamming equipment for electronics inside Israel, the assault itself, sea, air, and land, going through tunnels, breaking down walls, all this had to be rehearsed, and we've seen the videos of them rehearsing it. So this all indicates that there was an intelligence failure. So the question is then why? The best intelligence services in the world obviously have failures. I'm an alum of the CIA. We obviously had a failure on 9/11, right? So this is not really just criticism. We have to get to the bottom of what's happened here, and it's not just the Israeli service, right? So the U.S. Obviously has a presence there. Egypt, other countries in the region should have seen something, in my opinion. So why they didn't, I don't know. Certainly they will do an after-action report, not just to fix this not happening again, but they also need to know what they don't know about all the stuff that's going on in Gaza to prepare for the ground invasion. So I think there'll be an ongoing determination of what happened here. My speculation is that we have become too reliant on signals intelligence, intercepting communications between people talking about operational plans, etc. That's great if people are still talking on phones that we have access to. They're not using encrypted apps. If they don't have devices that may have been given to them by other countries like Iran that we can't collect on. And I think they might be looking at whether we became too reliant on that and don't have enough human intelligence in that area. From the perspective of a former intelligence officer, you can never really replace the need to have human resources collecting information in an area just by signals intelligence or overhead imagery, right? Because obviously all these groups, they got here, to Ken's point, survival of the fittest. If they didn't figure out how to get around a lot of these things, they wouldn't be here to launch this scale of attack, 1,500 fighters. So going forward, I think from the intelligence perspective, they are going to have to look at what went wrong as it relates to the upcoming ground offensive. I think they're going to spend a lot of time looking at how involved Iran, we can get into that later, but how was or wasn't involved in this actual attack. And I do think they're going to have to do an incredible level of collection really quick to have any chance to get these hostages back during this up and coming ground invasion. If that's what happens.
That's a great point, Mick, that you made about the potential over-reliance on signals intelligence. I've heard some speculation that Israel, maybe now that it's more than 15 years on since 2006 and the political changes that happened vis-a-vis Gaza at that point, that maybe their human network has deteriorated, and you've had this generation, younger generation of people in Gaza who have only grown up knowing the current circumstances. And so maybe that actually deteriorates their ability to penetrate in the same way that they have in the past. Mick, I wanted to ask you before we move on and ask Bilal about the regional, the potential for regional spillover. You mentioned that the U.S. should have been aware of this. Based on your experience, what can you say about, the United States only has so much capability that it's trying to, utilize globally. Is this something that the United States would actually prioritize, what is going on in Gaza in terms of collection or is this something that they sort of leave to the Israelis?
So that's a good point. U.S. intelligence has always been very thin, especially now with everything that's going on in the world. I think that the intelligence community in the U.S. would have relied heavily on the Israeli service for this, Shin Bet, the domestic service, Mossad, the external service, not exclusively, but obviously they're a world-class intelligence organization, and they have all the reason to really care about it. Obviously, speaking of those two services, I don't think that totally absolves the United States of what happened here. Again, I don't know, so I don't want to cast too much criticism here, and it really should be viewed as a corrective means. So determine what went wrong so it doesn't happen again. That's what's most important, not to just point fingers. And I think they will do that for the long term, but also the very short term, because there is, well, I know we're going to talk about it, the complexity of what we think this ground invasion is going to be so enormous that having basically exquisite intelligence is going to be required. It's not just good to have, it's going to be required to have any chance to get hostages back and not just have a massive amount of civilian casualties as this comes up.
Yeah, well, we're definitely going to get to the outlook for the offensive that seems to be coming. But first, let's go to, we talked about how did we get here. Let's talk about what might happen now. And Bilal, I'm hoping that you can speak a little bit about the potential for escalation, regional spillover from Hezbollah or anyone else. And especially if you could kind of home in on the calculations of a group like Hezbollah and as they calculate how to decide how far are they going to push this, and what are they worried about, and what are the opportunities that they want to seize?
Right, very good set of questions, Missy. So I feel like this might be a good time for us to throw conventional wisdom out the window, or at least challenge it, because Ken is right. These are unprecedented times. This is uncharted territory. The conventional wisdom we've always had about Hezbollah is that it is too valuable for the Iranians to be used in a fistfight with the Israelis when their chief purpose, or at least strategic purpose, is to deter an Israeli attack against Iranian nuclear infrastructure, right? Let me quote the Joker in The Dark Knight. His ace in the hole was Harvey Dent, right? For the Iranians, their ace in the hole is Hezbollah, and they're not going to risk it with a fight with the Israelis. That's conventional wisdom number one. And I'm going to challenge it in a minute. Conventional wisdom number two is that the horrors, the costs of the 2006 confrontation between the Israelis and Hezbollah are still very much fresh in the minds and the hearts of the constituency of Hezbollah. So this has to weigh on the minds of Hezbollah. They don't want to go on another adventure that would pretty much see the destruction of many villages in the south, razing to the ground of the southern suburbs in Beirut, and then having to reconstruct all of that and try to reconcile with your support base. That was a very difficult moment for Hezbollah at the time. And by the way, this time around, Iran is not going to be in a position to reconstruct all of that because they're broke, right? And so you have to think about those things that might itself be a deterrent against any full-fledged Hezbollah intervention. The third conventional wisdom is that, well, this time around, the IDF is much better prepared on its northern front. They've done nothing but learn the lessons of where they screwed up in the 2006 war. Everything that Mick just described in terms of surprise, in terms of intelligence failure, you're not going to see, or at least most likely, you're not going to see any of that on the northern front. The IDF's readiness level is much higher on the northern front because they have prepared very well. Those are the 3 bits of conventional wisdom. However, this is really uncharted territory. I don't know if Hezbollah is at a point where this is the return of the Mahdi. This is a historic moment. This is where Israel is most vulnerable. This is the time to pounce. I don't know of what kind of decisions they're making, but this is, I would say, if I were in the shoes of Hezbollah, this is a perfect time to make it at least more challenging for the Israelis to mount that ground incursion into Gaza in order to assist their Palestinian partners. Now, Iran also might be at a stage where it has reached nuclear latency, which means that there's point of no return in terms of their own nuclear capabilities, which means that they might feel a little bit less worried about an Israeli strike against them, which would give them a little bit more leeway to use Hezbollah in ways where in the past it was unthinkable. And you got to remember also, it's not just the northern front, it's also Syria now. The last time I checked, there's some movement of Hezbollah fighters into that part of the country, and that's just another option for Hezbollah to use. And obviously Hezbollah has its own military assets in Syria. They have their own troops there. The entire country, frankly, is firmly in the hands of Iran. So there might be an attempt to open something there. And I don't need to remind you that there's already been shelling on the southern Lebanese border on both sides. Hezbollah has lost already 4 of its fighters. They've used precision missiles. They've also used mortars to shell Israeli locations. Same thing for the Israelis. You got to remember, last time in 2006, all of this happened by accident. None of it was deliberate. I don't think the Israelis wanted that war. Hezbollah didn't want that war, but it happened anyway. And so these kinetic activities that we're seeing already being exchanged between Hezbollah and Israel could very easily lead to exactly what happened in 2006. They don't have to want it. It could just happen. And so the potential for escalation, given the unprecedented nature of this conflict, is pretty considerable. And obviously, the Israelis get a vote. The manner with which they're going to respond to Hamas's attack, whether it's going to be a full-fledged ground invasion or a more intense airstrike campaign, that's going to very much influence what Hezbollah is going to do. It's going to be incredibly hard for Hezbollah to sit this one out if Hamas starts to incur some considerable losses on the battlefield.
I have a couple of follow-up questions for you, Bilal, and then I want to ask Ken and Mick a little bit more on the Iran factor. Bilal, we're going to get into the American military response, the reinforcements and the repositioning in a few minutes, but how much do you think the fact that the U.S., Biden is out there pledging unqualified support for Israel in response to this, he's moving the carrier strike group, the Eisenhower to the Eastern Med, talking about expediting munitions, deepening intelligence sharing. How much of a factor is that in Hezbollah's calculus in considering its response here?
Perfectly honest with you, this is more of an issue for the Iranians to worry about, not so much Hezbollah. And I see those 2 acts of deterrence, try to contain this conflict, and send a pretty strong message to the Iranians not to open another front. And of course, a message of reassurance to the Israelis. Operationally, tactically speaking, I think they both know, very sadly, and I'd love to be wrong on this one, that even though we have deployed those military assets, I think very few Iranians actually believe that we're going to use them in order to get into this fight, even though we do have our own hostages inside Gaza. So if you're going to see any kind of U.S. military intervention, and Mick will correct me on this one, it might just be more of a joint special forces incursion kind of alongside the Israeli special forces in order to bring back as many as possible those American and Israeli hostages. But this time around, I think you're exactly right, Missy. This is primarily symbolic reassurance for the Israelis and hopefully deterrence against the Iranians.
Okay, Ken, let me go back to you. So the Biden administration, we had Jake Sullivan out there yesterday at the podium at the White House saying that, highlighting the long history of general support, arms training, funding from Iran to Hamas, but saying that the United States government like the Israeli government, it seems, does not have specific information at this moment that Iran played a direct role in planning this particular attack. Can you talk about how much does that matter in terms of, Hamas's ability to sustain a strong response to the Israeli incursion, to the U.S. and international response to what's happening? And if you could just talk a little bit about that relationship, the two-way relationship, and their motivations. Where do they overlap and where do they diverge? That would be great.
Sure. Great question. And actually, let me start, though, with kind of the American and Israeli statements about Iran, because I think that's actually meaningful. And my own sentiment, and I'm pretty comfortable in saying this, I don't think you're going to see the United States or Israel saying that there is a direct link between Iran and this until the Israelis have dealt with Gaza and are ready to deal with Iran. And I suspect what will happen is they will deal with, if they choose to do so, they will deal with Iran. And then maybe afterwards, they will explain why they did that in terms of the links, right? But right now, Israel wants to keep this localized to Hamas and Gaza. They don't want the Iranians being dragged in or Hezbollah being dragged in for some of the reasons that Bilal mentioned beforehand. If they start shooting off their mouths saying Iran is involved, right, that starts to complicate the situation. The more that they can simply say, we have no evidence that Iran is directly involved, that allows them to stay focused on Gaza. And as I said, I suspect that at some point the Israelis are going to decide whether or not they want to do something to Iran. And again, if they do it, only afterwards are they likely to explain why. So that's point number one. With regard to Iran and its relationship with Hamas, first, I don't think that Hamas had to go to Tehran and ask permission to do this. I think that Hamas has the agency to do it themselves. I suspect, though, that they did go to Tehran and say, we're interested in doing this, and we'd like help doing it, if only because, A, they do need Iran to have their back. They needed Iran to provide them with the supplies for this. They would probably go to the Iranians and say, hey, look, we're planning to do this, and we've got a whole bunch of ideas of how to do it. What do you guys got? Right? Are there things that you know about the Israelis that we can exploit? Again, I actually do see it as being fairly similar to the relationship between the Soviets and the Egyptians and Syrians before 73. Right? The only difference is that I think that in this case, when Hamas came to them and said, we'd like to do this, I think the Iranians were overjoyed, whereas the Soviets had reasons to want to dampen this. And so, as best we understand it, the Egyptians and Syrians didn't tell them the dates or that they were going to do it until after it actually started happening. Right. But again, I think that Iran has to be there for Hamas, largely because Hamas does want Iran threatening to intervene. They want Iran to get Hezbollah to threaten to intervene, to, as Bilal was suggesting, hopefully pull some of that Israeli pressure off of them, and then again, provide them with whatever technical support they need. Now, beyond that, I will also say, final point on this, I don't think that Hamas is looking for too much more at this point. And I'll go back to the first point that I made, which is Hamas has had they've been fighting Israel since 1987. They know Israel very well. I think they fully understood that this attack was going to engender a massive Israeli response. I think they've been preparing for that response. I think the Israelis know that they've been preparing for that response. Part of that had to have been to understand that the Israelis were going to besiege Gaza. Right, that the Israelis were going to lock down Gaza to make it impossible for anything to get in or out. So I think that as part of the preparation for this, Hamas got everything that they felt they needed from Iran already, recognizing that once they did this, they probably weren't going to be able to get much, if anything, from Iran afterwards.
Great. I definitely want to delve into that, and that's a great point on the sort of tactical planning, Ken. But before we do that, since we're on Iran, I want to go back to you, Mick, and ask, since you were in the hot seat at the Defense Department in the last administration when there was a lot of U.S. Iranian antagonism, clearly in the Middle East. there's some people who are already saying that, the fact that setting aside whether there was, involvement in the direct planning by Iran in this particular event, it just goes to show the kind of deadly fruits of this proxy relationship that successive administrations have really tried to curtail without success, and that this sort of shows that there has been a collective failure. What is your thought on that? I mean, seems to me like people have sort of run out of ideas about how to ensure or cut off this relationship that Iran has had with proxy groups in Syria and Lebanon, in Yemen, Bahrain. So what is your perspective on that? And are there other things that any administration can do to protect itself and its close allies?
So, Missy, starting with this recent assault, I would say there is a lot out there that indicates that Iran had some involvement. Obviously, historically, they fund quite a bit of Hamas's military budget. The weapons that they fire largely come from Iran. There's statements by Hamas spokespeople. There's news reports about meeting with IRGC. Just to point out what everybody already knows. I do think ultimately the decisions should come from the USIC, the intelligence community, if anything's going to come out of it. Policy-wise or operational tasking, so to speak. I do think, and I hadn't thought about it, what Ken brought up, I think when it comes to timing is probably correct. I think it's very likely that they don't want to just throw all this out at once when they have such a massive, operational dilemma right in front of them when it comes to this ground offensive. So specific to your question, Missy, yes, absolutely. We've been dealing with this for a long time. The military inside their special operations community has whole units dedicated to trying to do this. My old organization, the CIA, created a division for Iran, which is not usually the case. I'm not actually sure if it still exists, but it probably will exist tomorrow because of this. If it doesn't exist, it still exists. Because it is such a significant issue when it comes to collection and policymakers knowing what could happen, and obviously action. Doing things to disrupt the network, with a logistical supply network that goes across Syria, whether it's trying to create tension in between relationships. There will be a lot of discussion about how to do that going forward. I'm, maybe because of my background, like to see that mostly done on the covert and clandestine side. But certainly this will be discussed across the board, from ideas that are, recently saw from Senator McConnell, to ideas that aren't going to see the light of day about how to do this more effectively and how to cut off particularly the lethality of these groups when it comes to their choice of, their decisions on what to do against countries like Israel in the future.
Yeah. Okay, we're about at the halfway mark, and I want to maybe leave some time for questions at the end if we can. So maybe let's just jump into, because we're talking about the military dimension, it does seem like Israel is preparing to launch a ground incursion. So I'd like to ask the three of you to sort of weigh in on, to help our audience understand, what does that look like and what does that entail from an Israeli perspective, and then, support from the United States, given the geography, the density of Gaza, and then, Ken, as you pointed out, that Hamas would have anticipated a significant response and presumably prepositioned equipment, tried to, I guess, to ask the question, what would they want to do with the hostages in this situation? So, Bilal, do you want to start?
Yeah, let me start with that, but just add a comment about the attack itself. I think both of my colleagues will agree that just purely from a military perspective, this wasn't the most sophisticated operation, right? This was truly a result of the Israelis being caught sleeping. This was not just a failure of intelligence, even though that's very true. Mick is exactly right. This was a failure also of imagination on the part of the Israelis. There was just no belief inside Israel that Hamas would actually pull off something like this. So it was also a matter of analysis. It was also a matter of interpretation of information that they actually had. It's not like there was a total blindside. They did not have any intelligence that the Palestinian militants were actually rehearsing. As a matter of fact, they could actually see them. I have spoken to Israelis and they could see them rehearse this operation over months and months and months. It's just that they didn't believe that they could actually pull off something like this, which is in many ways, as Ken said, reminiscent of 1973. I mean, the information and the data was right in front of them. It's just that they didn't believe that they would pull off something like this. Now, give the devil some credit that, you know, the diversionary tactics were pretty brilliant, but once again, because Israel was caught sleeping. I mean, the barrage of missiles, the barrage of rockets, all of that was in the service of actually infiltration. But I remember, and I wrote about it with my good buddy Nick Blandford in 2011. This was a conceptual operation that was authored by Hezbollah. Hezbollah was the group that actually talked about infiltrating deep inside Israel, kind of a blitzkrieg. I know it's an often used terms and we don't want to overuse it, in order to cause psychological effect, in order to terrorize, in order to destabilize the Israelis. That's exactly what Hamas has done here. And so it begs the question, even though they look like a conventional armed unit, even though they are armed like them, but they didn't really have military aims per se. Their number one objective was to overturn the status quo because it was unacceptable for them. And tactically speaking, this was incredibly deliberate. It was not accidental to take as many hostages as possible with them back to Gaza, because Ken is exactly right. They're not stupid. They knew that the Israeli response was going to be fierce, and they needed some kind of a bargaining chip whenever the ground incursion actually happens. So to your point now, Missy, if there were to be a ground incursion, I'm not going to speculate about the number of casualties on both sides, because obviously it's going to be incredibly high. But to Mick's point, which is impeccable, you need almost perfect intelligence about the whereabouts, about the locations of those hostages, and they just don't have that. And of course, Hamas has already mentioned that they're going to execute hostages should there be a ground incursion, should there be a continuation of hostilities. Talk about being in an impossible operational position as far as the Israelis are concerned. I suspect there's going to be a combination of airstrikes and some perhaps limited ground invasion to see actually how it starts from the beginning and see how it actually goes. But I also suspect at some point there's going to be mediation, whether it's the Egyptians, whether it's the Qataris. This is not the time for it right now. These are not my words. These are Hamas's words. As long as there's fighting going on, nobody wants to talk about prisoner swaps. But at some point, there's going to have to be, because we're not talking about a single soldier like 2006 with Shalit. We're talking about dozens and dozens and dozens. This is not just Israelis. This is an international problem that includes American hostages.
All right. Mick, why don't I ask you really quickly, since you've personally been in some of these situations, what would it be like? Just sort of describe to us, to the audience, to launch, to push infantry and mechanized forces into, or what would they do to push into a place like Gaza?
So if the decision is made to do this, and it does look like that's what's happening, especially with the call up of 300,000 reservists, the active force for the IDF is around 170,000 troops. I think they would have to split this. I think it's been mentioned by everyone, Bilal and Ken, talking about how significant the threat is from the north. They probably have to put around 70,000 up there or maintain up there, and then use around 100,000 if they intend, if the objective is to dismantle Hamas and have a full-scale ground invasion. That's what's going to be needed. The 300,000 that are activated are going to be spread between the two. I would likely guess that they would come in from the north. There's only certain places, excuse me, there's only certain places where they really have the ability to breach. And then they will start in the north, and this will be the worst kind of fighting. It's one of the most heavily, densely populated places on Earth. It's multi-dimensional, so you're talking high rises, basements, tunnels. It is going to take a systematic block-to-block assault on Gaza to be able to actually do, if that is what their objective is, to do what they're doing. And they're probably going to push a lot of civilians to the south, and hopefully they have a way for them to get out, so they don't just caught and trapped in this. When it comes to the hostages, I think Bilal's exactly right. I think the United States is going to focus on, when it comes to our contributions, on trying to help them with intelligence and operational planning with our tier one units, JSOC, and of course, the agency, to try to help them really identify where they are. But even if they do, it is the most difficult, operation to conduct. It's very easy to kill a hostage, even if you have perfectly executed your plan. They can just simply turn around, and a lot of them are probably already in locations that are wired to detonate. So it is extraordinarily complicated. I think they're going to probably try to do it while they're actually conducting this major ground offensive, if that's what they do. And unfortunately, it will be very difficult to recover a lot of hostages. That said, it is something that I think all countries involved will really focus on, as they have an obligation to their citizens.
Ken, I want to go back to you, and I'm going to start to try to work in some of the questions. We have a relevant question from Charles Lister, which I think is good, which is, and maybe go to you with this one, Ken, and then you can add in whatever else you want to add on the tactical dimension. Is there any chance, Charles asked, is there any chance that Hamas's attack might turn out to be a case of catastrophic success, in that even Hamas didn't imagine they would achieve so much, and in doing so, they may have triggered a response far bigger than planned or anticipated? And that sort of goes to a point that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, so I'll start with Charles's question, and then I do want to come back and add some points to what Mick and Bilal nicely pointed out. It's certainly possible, Charles. I mean, you are an expert in this region. You know how hard it is to kind of keep all this straight. We don't know exactly what Hamas thought it was going to be able to do. It is possible that they did kill more than they intended. I'm a little bit skeptical of that at the moment. When I look at the number of different breaching points that they mounted, the three-dimensionality of the attacks, right? The number of fighters they sent in, that to me says they are looking to do a lot of damage. They're looking to do as much damage as they could have. So, it may be that they are at the high end of what they thought they might achieve. But again, I think that they were trying to achieve something just like this. So that's my gut right now. But again, I'm willing to be proven wrong if later on, when we finally find out what really was happening, we find out something else. But again, when I look at the military operation and all of the different ways that Hamas was trying to get at Israel and the numbers of personnel they sent in there, to me, it does look like they were simply trying to kill as many people as they could. And I want to put a fine point on this, as many innocent civilians as they could, right? I think that it's clear the Israeli soldiers were in their way. They were looking to get at the civilians and kill as many of them as they could. All right, now I want to go back and make add some points to Mick and Bilal. First point, we don't really know exactly what the Israelis want to do, and we don't know what they're going to ultimately decide to do. Right now, they're talking a lot about destroying Hamas, eliminating Hamas. I have no doubt that is what they want to do. I will also say that that is entirely within Israel's capacity. Should they choose to do so, they can do it. The real question, and both Mick and Bilal have kind of implied this, I just want to put it front and center. The real question for the Israelis is going to be about casualty tolerance. Right? If they want to go into Gaza and obliterate Hamas, they absolutely can do so. Right? I'm going to put another historical analogy on the table. It's the worst analogy of all, but it's the right one for this, and that is the Battle of Stalingrad. Okay, this will look like the Battle of Stalingrad, exactly the way that Mick pointed out. It will be three-dimensional combat in an urban environment. Right? That will be horrendous. Lots of people will die. But there are also very important differences between Gaza and Stalingrad. First point, most people don't even aware of this. These Germans actually took 90% of Stalingrad, right? They come that close to holding the whole city. And the whole key to their losses in Stalingrad are that they never encircle the city. They never cut it off. So the Soviets are endlessly able to feed new reinforcements in, right? The Soviets suffered even worse casualties than the Germans did in Stalingrad. Hamas can't do that. It has a limited number of fighters in Gaza, and they're not getting any more. So if the Israelis want to, they can go in there, they can wage this kind of a house. And again, come back to a point that Bilal made. He's absolutely right. If you want to try to do this pinpoint, you need exquisite intelligence, real-time intelligence, dynamic intelligence, because they will move hostages. They will move their own personnel. You're never going to get that. So the alternative is you do with this kind of a systematic operation that Mick was describing. And again, the Israelis absolutely have the capacity to do that. The question is, what level of their own casualties are they willing to tolerate? What level of Palestinian civilian casualties? And let's recognize that is another difference from Stalingrad. The Germans didn't care about Soviet civilians. Heck, for Hitler, that was a bonus, right? Israel actually will try to avoid Palestinian civilian casualties if they can possibly do so. But again, I think the biggest question out there, and it is simply an unknown. It's an unknown because we don't know what Prime Minister Netanyahu has in his head. He may be thinking, you know what? I just need to go in there and destroy this place. And if all the hostages die, so be it. And if I take 10,000 casualties in the IDF, so be it. He may believe that. That may be, and that may also change over time, right? He could start out thinking that. And if things don't go well, and if politically he starts to get blowback, that might change. On the other hand, he might, as Bilal suggested, start out with a more limited approach. And if it goes well, decide, I'm going to expand this thing. Right. So is it we know so little about what I see as the most critical factor here, which is how much is Israel willing to pay to obliterate Hamas, right? And again, as Bilal has pointed out, part of that payment is about the Israeli hostages. We don't know the answer to that, and we don't know how it will evolve for the Israeli leadership over time.
I want to turn to the American role here, but before we do that, two people asked a similar question, so I'm going to put it to you all now, and that was about Iron Dome. The question was essentially, was Iron Dome, was there a failure here, or let's just make it more broad, an air defense failure, and one specific element of that are the sort of projectiles that Hamas is using, are they kind of not suited for the design of those systems? Does anyone want to take that?
No, Missy, I don't think it was a failure. I mean, at the end of the day, there's a finite number of interceptors. So you're throwing at me thousands and thousands. I'm not going to be able to get every single one of them. And also, there's some that I just don't want to shoot because they're going to land in the desert. So, I'm not saying that the system is perfect, but that's exactly what we saw also in the Yemen war with the Saudis, right? It's not that difficult to overwhelm those air defenses. But it's also even more difficult when you've got thousands and thousands and multiple threats, not just the rudimentary rockets, but also the missiles. And so I don't think it's an abject failure. It's just frankly, a very expected, incredible challenge.
Okay. Sorry, does anyone else want to jump in on that?
Just very quickly, Missy, just to add 2 points. First, again, we don't know, but it may be that Hamas, with Iranian help or without, did modify the rockets in some way to make it harder. That's possible. We may find that out later. But just to add also to Bilal's point, knocking down a missile with a missile is really, really hard, right? Saudi Arabia Patriot gets about an 88, 90% hit rate. That's fantastic. But if, as Bilal says, you fire 1,000 rockets, even with a 90% hit rate, 100 get through, right? So again, I don't think that we know what the hit rate was for Iron Dome and the other Israeli systems yet. We'll have to find out afterwards, and then we can figure out, was it somehow unusual? Right now, it doesn't look to be.
Okay. Let's talk about the Biden administration's response here and the U.S. role. So there's the carrier strike group, which I believe arrived in the Eastern Med yesterday. There are more interceptors and other, small diameter bombs and some other munitions being delivered. But we did hear Jake Sullivan yesterday say we do not anticipate, or we are not planning American boots on the ground. So let's talk a little bit about what is the intent here with what is happening, the repositioning. Is it mostly symbolic? Are there things that the carrier strike group and the air assets that are associated with that will be doing? And what are the factors? It's clearly like a political military consideration. What are the factors that will inform, and what can we expect in terms of any further American role if there is or isn't expansion of the conflict? Who wants to jump in on that?
Go ahead, Mick.
Sure. So I definitely wouldn't call it symbolic, Missy. I mean, I guess that in a way people look at deterrence as symbolic, but I don't. I think first of all, the carrier strike group you just mentioned, the Gerald Law Board, does give us a level of deterrence, but not just that, also options in the future, right? So if Israel is overwhelmed, if just like this whole discussion, if they start taking significant activity in the north coming from Syria, and you know, to everybody's point, the Iron Dome is a great system, but it can be overwhelmed by the amount of missiles and rockets that are pointed at Israel right now, substantially overwhelmed. I do think it gives us an option should we decide politically to become involved, and it probably will be mostly via air. Until then, I think it will be just as we've discussed. We are going to send our special operations advisors over there, our intelligence folks, to try to help when it comes to potential hostage rescue, and also especially help planning this potential ground invasion. I think that is definitely going to happen. And finally, the United States, as it's played in the war in Ukraine, is going to have to help everything they can do to get the munitions necessary to keep this going if this turns into the ground invasion that we've been talking about.
And Bilal, you want to jump in?
No, that was pretty comprehensive. Thank you.
All right. One other question that I've been thinking about is, you know, what Hamas itself, and we've touched on this a little bit, was what its calculus was in terms of planning this attack. We've heard Israeli officials say repeatedly since this happened over the weekend, Hamas is ISIS, and American officials have also called these ISIS-style attacks. What can we say about how Hamas, you know, which, you know, does have this history of suicide bombings, but you know, if these reports of really brutal tactics are accurate, what does this say about the group? And is there anything we should be thinking about in terms of, you know, copycat effect from the Islamic State and everything that we saw from 2014 to 2017?
Ken, if you want to go ahead, and then I'll follow.
Yeah, I'll take a shot here, Missy. I'll at least start things off. And I think that you're right that I think Hamas's motives are actually very important here. And, you know, I do want to go back to 73 because I think the comparison is useful here because there's a real contrast. In the case of 73, I mean, let's set aside Assad, who just wanted his land back. In the case of 73, you know, Anwar Sadat ultimately has a very sophisticated plan. He is going to use a military operation to demonstrate to the Israelis that they'll never have peace as long as they hold Sinai, and so they need to make peace with Egypt, right? And I think in that, Sadat was reflecting what would be best for the Egyptian people. I see, unfortunately, no sign of that on Hamas's side, right? I do not think that they're trying to do the same thing. In fact, what Hamas seems to be doing is something different, right? First, I do think this very much is about derailing the Abraham Accords and the reconciliation between Israel and the Arab states, because that was very much to their detriment. But again, I don't think it was necessarily, there's absolutely no indication that Hamas wants peace negotiations with Israel, right? I mean, we could look at that and say, okay, this is a horrible war, but if you were trying to imitate Sadat, right, we would understand that. And yes, peace negotiations would then be a good, right step from it. And look, you know, we can all hold out hope that when the dust settles, that there will be a Palestinian leadership that emerges that says, let's try to translate this, you know, horrific event into a more meaningful peace. The problem is, again, that isn't going to be Hamas, right? Hamas has indicated absolutely no interest in peace with Israel. They continue to maintain this position. They want to destroy the state of Israel. As you point out, the way they conducted this attack is exactly the opposite of what Sadat did, right? We know Sadat thought long and hard about this. He did not want to threaten the Israeli civilian populace because he knew that had he done so, there would have been no hope of making peace, right? His whole calculus is predicated on this is going to be a war fought along the canal zone where there's nothing but Israeli soldiers, and I'm not planning on going beyond the canal zone. So I'll never threaten the Israeli populace. As we've talked about, Hamas was trying to kill civilians, right? You deliberately kill Israeli children, that does not lend itself to subsequently making peace. I think just to finish this off, I think this is much more about Hamas's perception. Again, they want to derail the Abraham Accords, but I think, and we've started to see people talking about this, there was a perception that Israel was deeply divided in terms of its own domestic politics. And I think that Hamas was hoping that this attack would split Israel apart. That is consistent with Hamas's entire ideology and its approach to the Arab-Israeli conflict, not, unfortunately, the way that Sadat approached it.
Just to quickly follow up before you jump in, Bilal, but isn't there an argument that could be made, Ken, that Hamas is actually alienating some of the countries that it should want to have the most support from, like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, because of those tactics? And how do you account for that?
Oh, no, I completely agree. But again, that's why I don't think this is a Sadat strategy, right? This isn't about limited war to make peace. This is as big a war as we can make, kill as many people as we can, not to make peace, but hopefully to derail peace between Israel and the other Arab states, and then to rip Israel apart to the extent that they can. Right? That's what's consistent with both what we have seen from Hamas in this operation and with their wider approach to it.
Okay, Bilal?
Yeah, I know, very well said. I don't want to oversimplify it. I don't want to sound flippant, but sometimes you just want to hurt. You just want to force a conversation. You just want to see the world burn. You don't really have to have specific military objectives. They recognize their limitations. They recognize the capabilities that they have. And so I think they've succeeded in all three fronts. They've hurt. They've forced a conversation on the Palestinian issue once again at a time when Ken is exactly right. People are talking about Arab-Israeli normalization. And so I think that they have done a pretty good job at that.
There's a question in the chat about the Abraham Accords. So maybe you could take this one. Does this mean that this is off the table for now? It seemed like, there was, even within the last 4 or 5 weeks, a more public discussion about this as a potentially attainable goal. Is this now moot?
So I'd actually like to hear what Bilal and Ken have to say about that. I do think that part of this may have been an attempt, maybe a small part, to disrupt the current discussions, negotiations, the mega deal, for example, obviously the Abraham Accords continuation. I don't know if it will actually be successful. I think it may at least delay negotiations for a while, but I think ultimately they'll get back on track. But quite frankly, I stick in the military and intelligence side of this, and I'd like to hear what the other two say.
Well, I mean, as far as we're concerned, Missy, we're obviously still going to say, oh, we're committed to this. Nothing's going to change. Oh, as a matter of fact, this makes it even more important that we pursue this. But at the end of the day, it's the Saudi position on this, right? The Saudi position has been pretty consistent. I don't think they care about the Palestinians. I think they understand that they have a responsibility towards them, given their position in the Muslim world. And so now that there's fighting going on, yeah, of course, this conversation is going to be put on hold. And I don't think it's going to be as close as what it was several days ago. Absolutely.
Okay. Ken, did you want to weigh in?
I think Bilal put it really nicely. I think he's spot on about that.
Okay, we only have about 6 minutes left. There are a couple of questions, and this isn't exactly the military dimension, but since there are several questions on it, there's several questions that get at the sort of Palestinian objections to the longstanding status quo, the settlements, and the paradigm that Gazans have been living under and people in the West Bank. How, I guess the question, I'll phrase it this way, how do you see the Biden administration, which has, continued to at least publicly espouse the goal of a two-state solution and criticize Israel for settlement activity? How does the administration balance that policy against what is happening right now. It clearly seems to be coming down the side of at least messaging, unqualified support. But can you talk about that a little bit? Because, it's not clear, I think, even to anyone that over time, as this continues, and maybe there's a punishing ground offensive that involves civilians, that'll remain the case. Can you, Ken, maybe you can address that?
Sure, glad to. So I think you've set the groundwork nicely, Missy. I think that we are seeing the Biden administration's thinking unfolding before us, right? And let's remember exactly what the president focused on yesterday. The point that you made before was the point that I just made. It is the horrific nature of these attacks, right? I'm going to say this again. The deliberate killing of children is never justified by anything, right? And, to the point that I just made, it's not consistent with a war for peace, right? Again, Sadat knew exactly what he was doing. Hamas could have done the same. If Hamas had wanted to, they could have mounted exactly these same attacks, right? Gone into even some of these different places and handed out leaflets, right? And said to people there, we could just as easily have killed you. We chose not to. Right? We only killed Israeli soldiers, pull back. Huge intelligence failure for Israel, absolutely shocking, right? Would have been devastating in terms of Israeli domestic politics, but it would not have killed children, elderly, other innocent civilians. It would not have engendered, this level of response. They clearly wanted to do so. That's the point that I made before. The military tactics that they employed are not consistent with that. And I think the Biden administration recognizes that. So right now, they are reacting to exactly what happened. Hamas has done something that is beyond the pale. It cannot be justified. Israel is our ally. Israel has been attacked in horrific fashion. It is our responsibility right now to stand with our ally as we stand with all of our allies when they are attacked. I do think that they are hoping that they can, in part by being so supportive of Israel, then have some influence over Israel and how it handles itself moving forward. And I'm also quite convinced, I'm quite certain that they are hoping that opportunities will present themselves to turn this situation in a more constructive direction. And I'm sure that they have a half dozen ideas of what a more constructive direction would look like. I don't think they know for certain. I doubt that they have a concrete plan for how that's going to happen, because you just couldn't at this point in time, right? It's got to be mostly about, for the moment, we've got to stand by the Israelis, right? Because of our values, because of the alliance relationship, because of how Hamas has done things, and the fact that what Hamas is signaling is they're not interested in some kind of anything constructive. Hope to use that as a way of influencing the Israelis. And then over time, we look for opportunities to start moving in a constructive direction. I mean, one obvious thing, goes back to a point that I made a little bit ago, is I think they're going to be thinking about, are there ways to use this whole thing to empower more constructive Palestinian leaders, right? Where is Salam Fayyad when you need him, right? Can you get someone who actually would like to make peace, who actually is interested in improving the lot of the Palestinian people, who could be involved in negotiations, right? I think that for the Biden administration, that would be a great outcome for this. But, right now, it's way too early. And you can't start, you can hope, but you can't plan.
Missy, can I add something to that?
Yep, we just got about 1 minute, so this is probably the last comment.
I'll reconcile some of the tensions Ken is struggling with here, is that we tend to forget that this is a terrorist organization. I mean, we're looking at the military dimension, that's right. But what they want is for the world to see, what they want is to hurt, and they're using 21st century military tools in the service of terrorism. And that in itself is frightening. We saw it in 2008 with the Mumbai attacks. Now we're getting a lot more sophisticated version of that. This is a renaissance, frankly, for terrorism scholars.
And okay, I'm going to squeeze in one final question to you, Mick, and in about 30 seconds, if you can. There was a question about Russia and China in the feed. To what extent, if at all, does this, and to keep it in the military lane, to what extent does this whole eruption complicate the Biden administration's, longstanding attempt to dedicate more resources to Russia and China? You've been in those discussions at DoD. How big a impediment is this?
Well, of course, we're always going to try to look at our most significant threats, whether it's China or Russia, but we have to be prepared to deal with the world events because that's the world we live in, not sorry, I don't know what that is, but not what we want, right? So there is going to be a challenge internationally when it comes to maintaining the level of munitions and weapons because there is a shortage. That's something that the U.S. military does better than anybody else.
Okay. Listen, we could go on for, I'm sure, quite a long time, but I want to thank everyone for joining us today and especially thank our panelists. This is a really great discussion and